This is week 11 of the course, and the topic for this week is international poverty. And for the reading for this week, we have the Sachs book, The End of Poverty, and we were looking at the first three chapters. And so this talk is broken up into three parts, with each part covering each of the three chapters in the book. So in the first chapter of his book, Professor Sachs visits four different countries that are at different levels of economic development. And the first country he goes to is Malawi, and the town is Nathandir. This is a small village that's living in extreme poverty. And one of the things he notices is that this country has a shortage of water supply, and that's because they haven't gotten rainfall in several months. So there's a climatic disaster. There's a climatic disaster that characterizes this country. He also notices as he's walking through the country that there aren't too many young, able-bodied men working in the fields. And this is partly because of the AIDS epidemic that's sweeping through this country. Up to 900,000 individuals are suffering from the AIDS pandemic. And he's noticing that it's mostly just grandmothers who are caring for the kids, often 5, 10, 15 kids. So very high fertility rates that he's noticing. And it's not just the AIDS pandemic that's spreading around this country, but it's also malaria and other diseases. So this country is just being ravaged by these different conditions. He goes to the next town over. Perhaps it's not the next town over, but he visits this next town. This is Blantyre, or Blantyre. And he visits Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And in this hospital, this is a hospital that was set up as a treatment program for AIDS, for the AIDS pandemic. So recall that there are approximately 900,000 individuals suffering from AIDS in this country. And the treatment, which is found to be 100% successful, costs about $1 a day. And out of those 900,000, it appears that only about 400 in this country have the economic means to pay for that $1 a day treatment. And so he goes into the medical ward, and it's not really a medical ward per se. This is essentially where people with AIDS are going to die. And the occupancy rate happens to be about 150, but there are 450 people stuffed into this one medical ward. They're lying there literally on top of one another. And he's painting the picture of a country that's suffering in many different ways. And so he characterizes this country as the perfect storm. This is a confluence of multiple different disasters going on. There's a climatic disaster, the lack of rainfall. There are diseases that are wiping out this country, AIDS, malaria, and different conditions. So this is a country that's on the lowest level of economic development. The second country he visits is Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is a step up. This is a country that does in fact have a foot on the ladder of development. This is a country where poverty is in fact in retreat, doing much better than what it used to do. So this is a country that was once dubbed an international basket case by the Henry Kissinger State Department back in the 1970s for their lack of political organization. But there are different indicators that show that Bangladesh is improving, at least on an economic basis. So this country is experiencing upwards of 5% economic growth per year. Other indicators, if we look at traditional indicators of health, namely life expectancy has increased from 44 to 62 years. Infant mortality rates have gone down in the last few decades. So this is a country that's experiencing some level of economic and social development. It's not out of extreme poverty yet, but still experiencing some progress. So in terms of what's fueling the economic growth in this country, Professor Sachs notes that there's a burgeoning garment sector. The garment industry is what's fueling the economic growth in this country. In the first town he visits, he notices this garment industry that's fueling the economic growth. That's in Dhaka. And there are women there who are often working, they're walking 2 hours to work one way, and they work often 12 hours a day under very severe conditions where the managers, under the threat of sexual harassment often, they have very limited breaks. And then after a long day's work, after 12 hours of work, they'll go home, walking another 2 hours, and and they're working under extreme conditions. These are what we would consider to be sweatshop type conditions. But despite what we here in the U.S. might think about those conditions, Professor Sachs notes that this is progress. This represents progress for women in this country. This type of industry, this garment industry, every developed country has gone through this type of development, and so Professor Sachs doesn't dismiss what's going on here. He's acknowledging that there are dire conditions, but this is representing progress. The third country he visits is India, and India is experiencing rapid economic growth. This is a step above Bangladesh in terms of their rates of economic growth. So this is a country that's experiencing upwards of 6% growth per year. And in India, it's the IT revolution that's primarily fueling this economic growth. And so he goes to Chennai. Chennai is the city that he visits. And in Chennai, he notices that there's an IT revolution. And there's an IT company, specifically, that he visits. They have an arrangement with a Chicago-based hospital where doctors at the Chicago hospital will send over these voice files, and there are medical data transcribers in India who will receive the files the next morning after they've been sent over overnight. And these medical data transcribers, it's this IT revolution that's fueling economic growth in India. The women in this sector are making $250 to $500 a month, which may not seem like much to us here in the U.S., but this represents, once again, significant progress. This is twice as much as what other low-skilled workers would receive for doing the same type of work for doing similar type work in India, and it's 8 times the income of what farm laborers would make. So this is a significant economic progress for that country. The last country he visits is China, and China is experiencing rapid economic growth. So these are 4 different countries representing different levels of economic growth. He visits Beijing. Beijing is the capital of China, but it also represents one of the world's economic capitals. This is where affluence is really noticeable, he suggests. And what's fueling the economic growth, 8% economic growth in this country, is primarily the export services revolution. So a country that was characterized by $20 billion of exports just recently, as recently as 1980, is now upwards of $400 billion in export services. And there's one little anecdote that represents the level of affluence in this country. He's at this show with some young hotshot businessmen, and he notices, and Professor Sachs notices, that these are cell phones that people in the U.S. that he's never seen in the U.S. And so that's one sort of indicator that the country is doing quite well, according to Professor Sachs. So in short, there's 4 countries here that represent different levels of economic growth. One, speeding full throttle ahead, that's China, upwards of 8% economic growth being fueled by the export services industry. And on the other end of that continuum, you have Malawi, that's still experiencing extreme poverty. In the last part of the first chapter, Professor Sachs gets into the concentration of poverty, where and who the poor are, internationally speaking. And he's looking at both extreme poverty and moderate poverty. And the way he defines poverty, he's adopting the World Bank definition. And according to the World Bank, extreme poverty is defined as having less than $1.25 per day to live on, and moderate poverty is in the range of $125 to $250 per day in terms of income. This is the World Bank definition, and so according to these definitions, he's looking at both the numbers living in poverty and the proportions who are living in poverty. That's worldwide, and the bottom line here is that according to the figures, poverty is concentrated in Africa and in Southeast Asia, and that's both in terms of extreme poverty and moderate poverty, to generalize across all the different figures that we see. So that's chapter 1 in a nutshell, and then in the next part here we'll look at chapter 2.